friends, and welcome to another episode of the Health After 30 podcast. Today, I am joined with Laura Kelly. Thank you so much for being here, Laura.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
So let's get into today's episode. I often find that we end up in training through some sort of interest that also sparks us to get into health. So wherever you would like to start, I would love to know about your training. I'd love to know about your health journey and just, how you got into helping women in what you do.
I've been extremely lucky to have not had any illness in my life. And I think that stemmed from when I was a child, being in nature and really just sort of connecting myself to it. I mean, I don't really know how else to say that. And then I just always sort of followed the path of listening to my body, and I just did that naturally. I had a desire to be a doctor when I was very small, like in kindergarten when they did those tests and they asked you what you wanted to be, and I would say neurosurgeon. I didn't even know what that meant. But my uncle was a neurosurgeon, and so I was like, that's what I want to be. And then I forgot about it, and then I became an artist, and I went to art school, and then I got out, and I was working successfully, and then I was like, something's missing, that I wanted to be a doctor. And I was like, wait a minute, I want to be a doctor. And I was 35 at that point. And so I set out to start medical school. And I was on this path, beginning at UCLA, and I was like, God, you know what? My brother is a surgeon, is a doctor as well. And I was on this path, and I was like, this isn't what I want to do. I don't want to do it this way, right? I was like, I'm not feeling this sense of like wonder in medicine, right? And I was like, where am I going to find that? How am I going to find out how to keep people well? And so I was like, I don't even know. So I went out and I found traditional Chinese medicine. Traditional Chinese medicine has 5,000 years of documented history. So it's a very rigorous, what happened in China in, 5,000 years ago is that there was a very organized system, and every state within China had their minister who was responsible for health, and they would all monitor the doctors and collect case reports and publish the case reports, and then they would come to the centralized, medicine minister for the whole country. And so it was very organized and very documented, and the scientific side of my mind needed this. And so I saw this, and I had some acupuncture treatments for the first time in my life, and I felt incredible. And I said, okay, there's data, and there's amazing things, and this is what I'm going to do. Mm-hmm. So I switched, and I went and got into acupuncture school, and I did the 5 years of the master's degree, and then did the 2 years of the doctoral training, which is sort of an integrative medicine, it's Western basics for primary care. Mm-hmm. Neurological testing and all those, lab testing and all that stuff, and then the Chinese equivalent from a primary care standpoint.
And now you work, I guess, as it would probably seem, is bringing Western, Eastern together.
Yeah.
And who do you primarily help now?
My main patient base became midlife women dealing with bone issues because my mother had bad bone loss for 17 years. And she came to me and she said in a panic, my doctor's going to fire me because I won't take the drugs. And what can I do? So I said, and Chinese medicine has a history of trauma medicine, which is something that people don't know much about, but it came out of the Shaolin monks. When the Shaolin monks were developing Shaolin Kung Fu, they were in their monastery and they were damaging themselves, right? Because they're practicing and developing a martial art. Mm-hmm. And so they developed alongside of this a trauma medicine. And it's wildly effective. And so it's herbal medicine that you're using either topically as poultices on your injury, and you're also working internally with herbs, right? Remember that, the medicine of China, as, different from the medicine of the West, this is like Western medicine grew up really in America. And Chinese medicine grew up in China. And it's a full medical system. It's just Chinese.
Yeah, very different.
Very different, but it's a full medical system. So herbal medicine is not just herbs. Herbal medicine is internal medicine in China. So in Western, if you're an internal medicine doc, you're dealing with all the organs and all the systems. Same thing with herbs. So there's an internal medicine component to recovery, and then there's a topical component to recovery. And this stuff works unbelievably. So I had a fascination with that because it was so effective, and it fits in this space where conventional medicine doesn't have anything. And this is like, the example is, I mean, I work with patients sometimes who have injuries, and this is trauma, right? Maybe they've ripped a muscle off the kneecap, for example, right? I had one of those. It was fully retracted. Had surgery, and then the surgeon was like, okay, here's your pain meds. Good luck with recovery, right? Come back and see me in 6 weeks. So it's sort of like there's this gap where there's nothing to help the tissue repair, there's nothing to help the blood flow, there's nothing to help the immune system. So there's a space in trauma in the West. And my medicine fits right in there. So I worked, for example, with that patient, and 6 weeks later I went to the consult, and he said to this patient, can you get up on the table? And the guy hopped up on the table, and the surgeon literally did a double take. Yeah. And he was like, what? So,
did you do?
Yeah. And the patient's like, talk to her. So we were able to generate tissue, bring blood flow, like do all the things that conventional medicine doesn't have. So
rejuvenative, restorative,
exactly,
healing.
Assisting the body's healing process and speeding it up. So that has always been of interest to me, just because of the space to fill in. So I had a history of knowledge of that. And so when my mother came to me and said, my God, what am I going to do about my bones? They're thin as paper. I looked to the trauma medicine for inspiration from the herbal side. And I also I looked at the World Health Organization data on fractures over time, over history, and found that there were 2 places that had very high fractures in Scandinavia and the US. And looked at the dietary components also of Asian countries, where they have typically much smaller bones, but very low rates of fracture on traditional diets. So I looked at all this information and I said, okay, these are the reasons. And I gave her a list, and she did some of them. And for the first time in 17 years, at her next scan, no bone loss. So we knew that we
And that was just dietary changes.
That was just that. She's never exercised in her life, unfortunately. So as a byproduct of that, her cardiologist called and said, how did you clear plaque out of her carotid arteries? And I said, well, because I put the calcium into the bone. So then she said, you need to write a book. And I thought about that. And so I thought, well, this is medicine, but it's done by mothers. It's not done by doctors. So I called my mother and I said, let's write a book. I'm going to speak the science. When you understand it, we can write it down. And that's what we did.
So you've kind of put it into terminology that everyone can understand then. You've made you've kind of simplified it.
That's right.
Wonderful.
So that came out at the end in 2017, I think. And then my practice sort of started becoming people reading the book, and it was published in Germany, and it was published in Spanish, so it was in multiple Spanish countries.
Congratulations.
And, thank you. And so then that became my patient base. So that's what I focused on, really, just because those are the people who came and said, can you do this for me, because you did it for your mom.
And as you said, it's just an empty void at the moment in Western medicine, so to say.
It's kind of a void. I mean, the medication, I'm not I started in going down the Western path. I'm not anti-Western medicine at all. But the drugs for this problem are not solutions.
So you started with, just to give us maybe a quick summary, because I'm sure it goes quite deep, and if people want to learn more, they can probably find your book. You started with nutrition. What else was a part of this reversing osteoporosis?
For me, what I do in terms of understanding how to work with the body is looking at the mechanisms and how the mechanisms function. Because all of the mechanisms of the body work in one way, which is through nutritional cofactors. That's it. There's nothing else, right? There's oxygen, there's water, there's, sunlight, there's nutrition, kind of it, and genetics. There's nutrition and genetics, and the interplay, really, of nutrition and genetics is kind of the fundamental mechanism of function of all of us. And all of us are 1,000% different from that perspective, right? For lots of different reasons, which maybe we'll go into. But looking at the mechanism of bone generation and what's required to make sure that, so bone bone is not static, right? A lot of people are like, wait, isn't bone just there? Isn't it just hard in there? So it's a tissue, just like every other tissue. And like every other tissue, except for our germline cells, our reproductive cells, their bone is turning over all the time, right? It's breaking down, and then it's building up, and it's breaking down and building up daily. So the process is called turnover, and that process, as long as the buildup is slightly outpacing the breakdown, then we have this sort of consistent, healthy density and healthy, right? As soon as you, for various reasons, lose your estrogen and then have nutritional deficiencies, because just losing estrogen is not enough to give you serious density loss. You get some, but it shouldn't give you osteoporosis. So that combined with no exercise, or no exercise and not the right nutrition, or bad gut health, so maybe you're eating great, but it's not getting where it needs to go, or genetics. So there's all these pieces. So it's looking at the mechanism and how these things influence that mechanism. What nutritional pieces are needed in order to make that mechanism function? How does that process work from when you put your whatever it is in your mouth? How does that make the bone work? So that's what I looked at and said, okay, well, these are the pieces that are necessary, nutritional pieces that are necessary. These have to be together at the same time. Here are the factors that influence how your body is able to heal. And so all of this data is kind of what I think about and put together. Yeah.
Midlife women going through perimenopause, women going through menopause, they are, perhaps more prone to or at risk of getting osteoporosis. So I guess that's the biggest market for these people, and probably also the most research that's maybe going in there as well.
Yeah, it certainly is. I mean, I think that, unfortunately, I don't know how it is in Germany, but in the US, it's been made very clear from polling and from discussions that the world of midlife women's medicine is virtually non-existent. I mean, when they do polls and ask physicians, how confident are you talking to your menopausal patients? I mean, 2% of physicians, 2% say they feel confident talking to midlife women. So there's like nothing in there. There's nothing. It's like women's health is about reproductive time. So what do you do? So creating these kinds of, coming in and creating these kinds of solutions started with the impetus of my mother, and then I became that age. So it's sort of like I started doing work so I could come into this with knowing what to do. Yeah.
Beautiful. So share this with us a bit, because this is, every woman is going to go through this, and for the medical system not to support that, that's huge. There is, a quarter of women who are already in this postmenopausal phase where these changes have happened. We need to be supported a bit more. So what are some of the biggest changes that we don't talk about that are happening for women going through this perimenopausal and menopausal phase?
I mean, from a sort of, a biological standpoint, you're obviously having loss of generation of sex hormones, right? So the body's changing in this way, and really, the symptomology just runs the gamut from I feel great but I'm exhausted to I feel like I'm going to kill everybody and I can't leave my bedroom. So, and then relationships start to be troubled, and then as these things sort of continue, and I think that in my experience of speaking to people, which I've spoken to, worked with thousands of women, this kind of sense of loneliness creeps in, and this sort of sense of I don't really know what's happening, I don't really understand, and I don't know what to do about it. And maybe it's just me, right? This I've heard a lot. And what's normal, and how am I supposed to function, and these kinds of things. And it's not like there's support anywhere. It's like if you're working, it's not like there's support in the workplace. It's like, okay, well, you're not showing up for work, right? I mean, it's almost like you have a sickness. It's almost like that, I don't want to say it like that, but because it's not, but the symptoms can feel like that, right? But there's no support for that particular problem. So I think that just sort of, that's kind of almost the worst side of it, I would say, for a lot of people. And then a lot of women are told there's nothing. I mean, I created a second company which makes vaginal health creams because it's such an important, it's like you keep your face well, you keep your skin well, you brush your teeth, and then this tissue also needs to be cared for. And when you do that, it changes your entire everything. I mean, the results of this from women using it are so beautiful. But these things are not known, and these things are not offered. So I think that's just this big space again. I mean, I think this is what I do. I'm like, oh, there's a space over there.
We're having this conversation, and that people like yourself are doing the work. You know, you're seeing the spaces and, you know, putting knowledge there.
Yeah, exactly.
Can we go into women's sexual wellness?
Yeah,
for a bit, because I feel this is, you know, as you said before, estrogen's dropping, so there's a lot of things that are different happening. And you also said that women, we work with our reproductive hormones, and I feel as we navigate through these phases, things are changing. What do we need to know? What's happening there? How can we optimize our sexuality or our sexual wellness?
Sure. I mean, coming from, let's look at the history of this, right? And the history of this is that there was a bunch of research done in the 50s on, horse urine, estrogen replacement for women. And all of those studies said that it caused cancer and that everybody should be afraid of doing hormone replacement therapy, and that was it, right? And so, my mother doesn't use any hormone replacement therapy at 82. She never had, because she was scared of where we're coming from, right? Is that we were scared and said, okay, well, it's too dangerous, we're not going to do it. And current research and current ways of doing this are much less, I mean, if that research was correct, but if, there are people who have estrogen-dependent cancers, right? So there is some risk somewhere. But it's not what it seemed. And there are safe ways of doing, for example, hormone replacement for everybody, no matter what your risk is. And this kind of brings me around to the concept of precision medicine, which is really doing medicine for that individual. And when you're dealing with something like this, you have to do that, right? I can tell you that in my experience, women come and I ask them about this, because when you want to increase your bone density and also increase your sort of like good life health span, right? Hormones are actually kind of a key component to both. You don't need hormones for good bones. And I can tell you that women come in two things. One, my doctor told me I would have a stroke and will not give me any hormones. And the other one is, oh yeah, they gave me hormones years ago. Did anybody ever look at this particular woman and decide what the right answer was? Never. Not once has anybody come in and said there was data used in making the decisions. The data used in making the decisions was how the doctor felt about them having a stroke, because the doctor was scared, or the doctor didn't care and just gave them. So there's this kind of like, okay, well, that's terrible medicine, right? That's not how you do medicine. So you can gather this data on yourself, and this is what I did, and this is what I built for people to do, which is like, how do you know what to do with this? So you gather data, and the data is, do you carry genetics for reproductive cancer? Most people don't, right? It's a very small percentage of people that actually carry a genetic predisposition for this. But if you want to know, and you should know, you should find out. It's not an expensive test. Let's just be sure about that. The second piece of information is, how do you detoxify estrogen, right? Even if you have no genetic risk. The way that you develop reproductive cancers is through something called a DNA adduct. And this is like a little damage to the DNA. And if you look at slides of women who have like breast cancer and slides of women who don't, the DNA, the damage to the DNA in the breast cancer, you can see it. So the way that this occurs is your body has a choice when it detoxifies estrogen of 3 separate detox pathways. So if using 2 of them that are the good pathways, then there's a third pathway, and it's a bad pathway because it breaks down the estrogen into a damaging metabolite. And that damaging metabolite, that's the metabolite that damages the DNA. So if you're preferentially or creating a lot of that damaging metabolite, you're going to have more DNA damage. So you can look at how your body is doing this. And you can say, okay, if I'm creating a lot of these bad metabolites, and here's the thing is, you shouldn't test anybody unless you can do something about it, right? So if I'm creating a lot of damaging metabolites, I can use natural substances to shift that detox choice in the body and then stop creating those damaging metabolites. If you want to, and everybody, in my opinion, if you are comfortable using hormone support, absolutely do it. It improves the research on dementia, on brain health, on cognition, on skin, the whole thing. So gathering this data on yourself, which your doctor's not going to do, so you need to do it, and then working with somebody who understands that everybody has an opportunity for some type of support. It just has to fit within their own requirements of their own body.
But that also sounds like precision medicine. Is that what it's called? Like it sounds like it's a very individualized approach. So, I mean, is that accessible for everyone to be able to do that?
Yes. They're kind of, if you're coming from the perspective that I'm coming from, having looked at this, there is no way to make a general recommendation for medicine about anything.
We're all individual.
We're all individual. It just is that way. And so to optimize who you are and to optimize, safety and things like this, it really is the answer. Because there's no way, I'm not comfortable if somebody says to me, I want to take estrogen. I'm not comfortable saying, yeah, sure, go ahead, right? I don't know. There's a tiny chance. Now, it's very small, but there is a tiny chance that it may not be the right thing in the form that they're asking for. And so my conscience as a medical provider is that I can't say yes until I know that it's safe or the right thing for them.
Yeah, so I mean, the women should know that, if you are going to a doctor and they're just kind of handing stuff out like candy, then perhaps it needs to be double questioned, and also to ask to get a more individualized
Well, I
approach.
think it's, again, 9 times out of 10, it's probably going to be fine. So maybe I'm overcautious, and I'm a data nerd, right? But I prefer to work that way, right? I would prefer to know about myself. I prefer to know about my patients. I prefer to know. So we can make exactly the right decisions. But there are things that you can do which are generally safe for everyone. And those are things like there are herbal formulas and there are herbs that are estrogenic. So they're phytoestrogens. And this was part of the discussion of the sort of the fear factor that came out of the previous research. Oh, no, we can't eat any soy because it's estrogenic, right? So the research that's been done in the past 20 years has absolutely refuted that and said it is definitely not the case. And actually what they find is that the phytoestrogenic plants decrease cancer risk and decrease recurrence of reproductive cancer. And biologically, that makes sense because there are 2 estrogen receptors, and one's the alpha and one's the beta. The alpha receptor is like a generative receptor. It's for your mammalian estrogen, and it sits in the receptor and it generates breast tissue and it generates babies. The beta receptor is where the phytoestrogen is preferential to. And the beta receptor for estrogen is actually a tumor suppressive response.
Okay, yeah.
So the plants are actually acting as tumor suppressors, and the endogenous, the estrogen you make is actually acting as, a risk factor. So the reality of this is that every woman of every age, reproductive age, should be employing tumor suppressive plants along to balance out her natural estrogen. And if I could rule the medical world, I would make people do that because you're going to have so much less reproductive cancer if you're balancing this natural estrogen.
So let's give me a top 3 estrogen suppressing tumor foods, or where to find them in the plant kingdom, perhaps, because maybe it's not all in food.
Yeah, red clover is a really wonderful herb for that. So red clover is really good. There's Chinese herbs. I'm a proponent. There's an herb called dongwei, which is a really effective herb in this regard. Soy is a great herb for this. The properties of soy are quite powerful, right, from this regard. So, and it's something that you can eat. You can eat that every day if you're not eating too much of it. And let me say about soy also is that you want to also be eating seaweed. Or you want to be having a product that's made properly. In the old ways of making soy milk, you would use kombu. You would use the seaweed to balance out that goitrogen aspect to it.
Okay, that's got something. So yeah, what does the seaweed component bring to the soy?
Iodine.
The iodine, okay, which is helping with the absorption.
Yeah. Well, no, it's helping with, there is some indication that overconsumption of soy is going to act against the thyroid. Iodine in that is going to balance out any of those propensities, especially if people are using soy as a primary source of protein, then it becomes important. Yeah.
Can we just clear up a few things here? Because that's also, I feel, gets talked about a lot. So I feel like in the West, anyone who perhaps follows a vegan or vegetarian diet, meat gets swapped out, dairy gets swapped out, and everything kind of gets swapped out for soy. So you've got, a soy latte with your soy yogurt, and then a soy burger with tofu this and tempeh that and soy. So where do you draw the line with what's the quota on soy per day?
Generally speaking, 2 to 3 servings, probably absolute max, right? I mean, that's what I would do. I mean, it's sort of everything in moderation. Right? As my grandfather used to say, everything in moderation, including moderation. In this case, I think, you don't want to be plowing yourself like this. You want to find other options for sure.
So just with the food, red clover, dong guai, and then we have tofu or soy, let's say. When it comes to non-herbs and perhaps, and you also said soy with a seaweed. When it comes to more foods, is there just 2 other foods that we can keep in mind that we should be having on a daily basis? The ones that are going to suppress the cancer, the tumors would be
right.
the most beneficial, I guess.
So mung bean is really an excellent food. Mung beans are huge cancer suppressors, and they also provide phytoestrogen as well. So that's a really good one. And the last thing that I would say is actually not a food, it's sunlight. Vitamin D ends up being a hormone right at the end of its sort of breakdown cycle, and influences everything in the system. And, what we're remembering now is that there is a phase of sunlight which is pre-sunrise, and there's sunrise, and these are all different frequencies of light, this frequency. And then there's UVA, and then there's UVB, and then there's UVA, and then it goes to sunset. And each of these phases has different frequencies, and they activate different responses in the eye, in the brain, in the hormone cycle, in the neurotransmitter cycle, right?
I love it. It's like, it's so important, everyone.
When we start doing that, I have come to this place of understanding nutrition is really important, herbs are really important, all of it, exercise is really important. But if you just did that, so you would sleep better, your hormones would regulate better, your neurotransmitters would regulate better, your skin would be better, your hair, it's sort of like, oh, wow, okay.
Yeah, the importance of it. Oh, it's really good to hear that. Like, I love hearing, and just reiterating how important that is. And I come from Australia, so there was a big campaign, sun cancer, and just, we're fearful of the sun. Yeah. Putting hats on, putting sunscreen on, wearing long sleeves, slip, slop, slap. We're a sunny country in Australia, but you would kind of go out just completely sun protected. The vitamin D deficiency is huge there, just because people don't actually expose themselves to the sun that's there.
That's right.
Yeah. Oh, thank you for that reminder.
Unfortunately, my chronotype is like later night and not later rising. And so it's very hard for me to get up and see the sunrise, but it's in my working towards perfection, I'm trying to see if I can start getting up earlier.
If people, you have a wealth of information, and as you said, it's a space that's just not being talked about yet. For anyone who's listening, who's like, I need more of this. Where can we find you, and where can we find your books as well?
Yeah, I'm online, like everyone. drlaurakelly.com, Dr. Laura Kelly. Yeah, that's the best way.
Yeah.
Nice. The first book was in 2017, and that was The books, there are two of them. So they're both structured the same, which is the first part is science for lay people, and the second half is cooking, so that you can understand sort of how to put ingredients together to help this skeleton and health in general. Yeah. And then the second book came out at the end of last year, I think in October. And this is the Healthy Bones plant-based. So it's a vegan vegetarian, because I saw so many people who are, when you look at the literature and the research, if you're doing vegan diets properly, then your bone health is actually better. Mm-hmm. But there are so many people who go plant-based without actually knowing how to do it. You have to do a little bit of work. So this book is for those people to understand what they absolutely need to do in order to be healthy on a plant-based diet with good bones.
Yeah, I mean, and also, vegan or not, just to understand how to put foods together so you're having the cofactors that are going to help the nutrients that you need so your body can benefit from it most.
That's right.
Yeah, great. Again, just what the world needs. Thank you so much for being here and also sharing your knowledge and your passion too. I have one last question. So imagine you have a massive billboard in Times Square and you're allowed to kind of put one thing on that billboard which everyone's going to see. What would you choose to put up on that billboard?
I don't know. I mean, can I say make love in the sun?
Yes.
Okay. I think lots of the world's problems would be solved if we did that.
Oh, thank you so much, Laura. This was such a delight. I so enjoyed our conversation. I enjoyed you being here. Thank you. Thanks so much for being here. You could have been listening to anything, but you're here interested in reclaiming your health. I hope you found the episode useful and constructive. If you enjoyed it and would like to show support for the show, please leave a review, as this makes my content more discoverable for other people to enjoy and learn from. Please also consider subscribing to the show on Spotify or Apple Podcasts or wherever you enjoy listening. Finally, the best way to show support for the show is by sharing it with someone who you think might benefit from it. Thanks for listening, be well, and I'll catch you next time.